So today we're going to be talking about Acts. We're going to start our study on Acts. And today's going to be a little bit more informational than inspirational. I'm kind of just setting the stage. For you guys who know anything about Acts, especially in New Testament scholarship, there are all sorts of debates about Acts, right? I'm not going to go over everything with a fine-tooth comb, but I do want to cover some things in broad strokes, right? So Acts has gone by several different names. Simplest and earliest form is just Acts, right? Majority of the manuscripts we have is called Acts of the Apostles, all right? That's the vast majority of what we find. Appearing in some manuscripts, we have it rendered as Acts of the Holy Apostles. And probably the most rarest one is Acts of the Apostles and Evangelists, all right? So quick, in broad strokes, an overview. What is the book of Acts about? If someone were to ask you what's it about, what would you say? Just
history.
What's that?
History.
It's about history. That's good. Give me a little bit more than history. History of the early church, right? Absolutely. The beginnings of the church and the spread of the gospel after Jesus' death and resurrection, right? It's the earliest account of church history that we have in Scripture. Who are the main characters, the main ones? You have Peter. It's covered roughly about chapters 1 through 12. Paul's first introduced in chapter 9. But then he kind of becomes the main character from chapters 13 through 28, right? How many years does it cover?
40?
Very close.
30.
30 years, 3 decades, right? Roughly, so that's from Jesus' resurrection to Paul's imprisonment in Rome, right? But the interesting thing about Acts, it's kind of unique, right? Especially in the New Testament. It's a 2-volume work. So you can kind of think of Acts kind of like Luke part 2, right? And at the very beginning of the book, in the prologue, one portion says, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and teach, right? Now, based on that description, what are some other titles that would have been fitting for this book?
Acts of the Holy Spirit.
Acts of the Holy Spirit would have been a very good one, yes. Yeah, what else?
Luke part 2.
Luke part 2 would have been great. It's probably good why I didn't write it, because that's probably what it would be. Yeah. So Acts of Jesus through the church, Acts of the Holy Spirit, these are just some ideas. Or given what it says here, I wrote all about Jesus began to do and teach, what Jesus continued to do and teach, right? To whom was the third gospel and the book of Acts addressed? Because they're by the same author, right? Do what?
Theophilus.
Theophilus, right? Some of you guys will get this, right? Every time I read the book of Luke or Acts, this is all I hear in my head, right? So you kind of know how Alan's mind works, right? It seemed good also for me to write an orderly account for you. Most excellent Theophilus. All I hear is Bill and Ted, right? And then in the prologue of Acts, in my former book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and to teach until the day he was taken up to heaven, after giving instructions to the Holy Spirit to the apostles he had chosen. All right? Now here's a question. What does the name Theophilus mean?
Lover of God.
Lover of God, right? It comes from the Greek theos, which means God, philos, which means loved, loving our friend. Kind of the same way, like the word philosophy. So thea means wisdom. Philosophy is lover of wisdom, right? So Theophilus, lover of God.
Is that someone's name, or is that, or is it said between?
There's actually some debate about that. Thank you, Kathy. So yes, here are some options that have been thrown out there, right? One is that it's a symbolic name, right? So not a specific person, but rather since it's, lover of God, loved by God, it's a symbolic name for any person who loves God. So it can be dedicated to fellow believers, right? And one of the things in support of this view is that Luke and Acts seem to be intended for a wide audience, it seems. Another option would be this. It's a person of high social standing. Why would I say a person of high social standing? Because he says most excellent, right? Title most excellent was commonly used for a person of prestige and rank. Can you think of any examples in Scripture where we hear someone being referred to in this way? Say it again?
Festus.
Festus, right? One is Festus, one is Felix before him, right? So in the book of Acts itself, Acts 24:3, everywhere and in every way, most excellent Felix, we acknowledge this with profound gratitude. Then his successor, this is when Paul is telling about like his vision, and then Festus says, your great learning has driven you mad, it's driven you crazy, right? And Paul responds, I am not insane, most excellent Festus. What I am saying is true and reasonable. So it could be a high-ranking Roman convert who supported the wider circulation of the gospel. Another alternative that's been thrown out there is that it could have, and this is just a bare possibility, I have no way to know if this is true or not. Theophilus, I would assume, is kind of a common name back then. But one would be Theophilus, son of Annas, the high priest, that was holding that position from 37 to 41 AD. That would be interesting if that was the case, right? Now, of course, that would be Jewish, right? But some say, well, maybe that was during a time of persecution of Christians. It wouldn't be illogical for somebody to reach out and, have some correspondence with Theophilus. Or, there's that part in Acts where it talks about, like, on the day of Pentecost, even a good number of priests came to the faith. Could this be one of them? Don't know. Just a bare possibility. Have no idea. But more likely, most people think that pretty much what's going on here is it's a patron. What do I mean by a patron?
Supporting it financially.
Yeah, someone who's supporting it financially. A wealthy patron would agree to finance the publication of these meticulously historical accounts to ensure that they reached a wider audience, right? So Theophilus is the dedicatee, if you will. But was a patron really necessary back at that time? What do you think? Yes or no? Yes. Why? It wasn't cheap. When a book was created, the materials were used, the ink and the vellum and so forth, they could kind of get costly. And not only that, but if you wanted others to read it, what else would be necessary?
So copy, of course.
What's that?
Copy.
Copyist, right? Was there a printing press back then? No. That was also costly. Well, what would make making copies costly? Kind of a no-brainer, but humor me.
Later.
The labor, right? How many people were literate back then? Not a whole heck of a lot, right? Literate rates were low, not only in Aramaic, but also in Greek. And to put this into perspective for us, if you had to venture a guess, considering the first century, how much do you estimate it would cost in today's currency to acquire a copy of, say, the Gospel of Luke? If you just had to guess.
100 denarii.
In today's currency. I am not using denarii. What's that? 10. Okay, you say 10,000?
A million.
A million? Dang. All right.
I'd say 100,000 plus.
100,000 plus, all right? So here's the deal. I'd heard several things over the years. I've heard like 5,000, 10,000. There was an article back from 2016. It was by, I believe it was by Jimmy Akins. I mean, it's back from 2016, 11 years ago, or 9 years ago. He estimated for the Gospel of Luke, in today's equivalency, would be $2,377, all right? Now, keep in mind, Luke Acts is a 2-volume work. So that would bring that to $4,615 per copy. So to distribute those works widely and reach a broad audience, securing a patron to fund the project would be essential. It also might help to clue you in why you ever wonder, why aren't they not more exhaustive on details, on things like in Jesus' life, on things like we read about in Acts, right? A lot of it was for purposes of economy, right? This stuff ain't cheap, right? And back according to the ancient biographies, you would be very selective about what you were going to choose to share and not to share. Didn't always have to be in chronological order. In fact, most of the time wasn't, right? You would have compositional devices like telescoping. Has anybody ever heard of that? Do you know what I'm talking about? Telescoping is like, say, if like two events were separated by a long gap of time, but you put them in their work, it sounds like they happened right side by side, right? Compression. Also, you have displacement. Depending on the theme or what's being communicated, you might have an event that happened way forward in time, but it fits the purpose of my message to kind of put it here earlier in time. So do I think they're true? Yes. But truth and precision are two different things. If you've ever been to seminary, that's something you'll learn straight off the bat, right? So it's important to understand this because ancient biographies didn't necessarily operate by the same standards that our modern biographies do. Does that make sense? Cool. All right, talking about the authorship. A lot of debate on this too. Luke and Acts are strictly speaking anonymous. What do I mean by strictly speaking?
Doesn't say it in the body.
It doesn't say it in the body of the text. Thank you, Matthew. Nowhere in the text does the author say, I, Luke, am writing this. That's what I mean by strictly anonymous. But we do know the same author wrote both Gospel of Luke and Acts. That's pretty much uniformly agreed upon. Granted, you'll find outliers to everything. There's no idea that's so absurd someone doesn't hold it. But the vast majority would agree with that. Also, we can tell by reading it that the author is pretty well educated. He has a good literary form of Greek. Right? It's a very high, elite Greek. Maybe not as high as like some of the, like Thucydides, Polybius, people like that, but pretty high compared to the Greek in other portions of the New Testament, right? Yeah.
What's it mean?
So we'll get to that too. There's a lot of debate on that. I'm inclined to say yes. But yeah, we'll get to that. And not an original apostle or disciple of Christ. Now, why would we say that? How would we know, just from the text itself, that this is not an original apostle or disciple of Jesus?
Because he refers to them in the third person.
Okay, he refers to what in the third person?
The apostles as others.
Okay. All right. First others in the third person, yeah?
The other reason is he wrote that after Christ resurrected. He didn't know Christ. To be a disciple, you have to actually have witnessed with.
Okay, so that's the question is, how do we know he wasn't a disciple? Let me give you a hint. Very first several verses right off the bat. What does he say? Someone read this.
Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write in order of different.
What there clues you in?
The investigate.
The investigate part, right? If I was already part of that, why am I investigating? Could be one.
It says,
First one I would.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah, you're like, yes, that one. So just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. All right, so he's kind of telling us then it's based on eyewitness testimony, not on my own, but this is where I'm getting my sources. This is where I'm doing my investigation. And there's also some debate whether or not they could have been a participant in some of the events, given that he says fulfilled among us. Maybe, maybe not. So not an original apostle or disciple of Christ. He knows his Old Testament in the Greek Septuagint version. What was the Septuagint? The Greek translation of the Old Testament, right? That's the main thing that you're seeing being used in Jesus' day. He has excellent knowledge of political and social conditions in the mid-first century. Now, some people will debate that and be like, no, I think there's all sorts of mistakes, whatever. We'll come to all that as we get to it. Trust me, the accusations are legion. Thanks a great deal of the Apostle Paul. And the internal evidence suggests that the author of Acts traveled with Paul. Again, something else that's greatly debated, but we'll talk about that because you can't really get so much in talking about authorship without first discussing the we passages, right? What is meant by the we passages in Acts?
it says he was witness on it.
Okay, what is meant by the we passages? Go ahead.
He was an active participant.
Okay, that's what follows from it. What is meant by the we passages? Do you know, what are we saying?
And the subject changes from they to be.
There we go, yes. So on several occasions, the narrator moves from the third person narrative, say like what they were doing, to the first person narrative, what we were doing. So you find this in 4 passages or 3, depending on how you splice them up. First place we see it starts in Acts 16:10 through 17. This is where Paul has the vision of the man from Macedonia. The narrative shifts to we. We sought to go into Macedonia. And it continues their travels to Philippi, where we find things where Lydia is converted, where Paul is arrested, stuff like that. Then it breaks off. It comes back again, Acts 25 through 15. where it describes Paul's journey from Philippi to Troas and onward by ship. Again, the narrator says, we sailed away from Philippi. Then breaks off, and back in Acts 21, 1 through 18, narrates the journey from Miletus through Tyre and Caesarea to Jerusalem. And when we had parted from them and set sail. And continues until Paul's arrival in Jerusalem. We went into the house of Nason, where we were to stay. And then finally, Acts 27 until the end of the book. The long sea voyage and the shipwreck on the way to Rome, right? We all remember that one? Begins with, and when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, it continues all the way until Paul arrives in Rome, where it says, and when we came into Rome, Paul was allowed to stay by himself with the soldier who guarded him. So, what does the natural reading of these passages, on face value, would that seem to indicate? And you guys kind of already answered that, right? It seems to suggest that
He's with them all there.
he was with them, right? He was present during those events, and that's the view of most confessional scholars. Now, I'll talk about this a lot when I speak of confessional versus non-confessional, or confessional versus critical scholarship. What do I mean?
Believer?
Yeah, typically if you're a believer, right? So if you're a confessional, even this is in broad strokes, it's not quite fair to say that someone who holds otherwise is non-confessional, because there's confessional ones I do know that deviate from some of the traditional authorship type stuff. But in terms of how I describe it, a confessional scholar starts with the assumption, the presupposition, that the Bible is God's inspired word. And so that's the supposition they bring to the table, right? Those who are more critical or non-confessional will have the mentality of like, this is just an ancient collection of documents. I'm going to set aside any beliefs in inerrancy or inspiration, put that aside, put my faith on the shelf, and just kind of go by this and make my decisions on unfettered human reason. Make sense? And that's the distinction, all right? So I would describe myself as more of someone who's confessional, right? And again, that's in broad strokes. Some observations we have about the we passages. One is concerning where the we begins and ends. In 16:10 and following, the we begins from moving from Troas to Philippi. Then after Paul and Silas leave Philippi, the we breaks off. But years later, when Paul comes back to Philippi in Acts 20, the we picks up again and continues until the end of the book. What would these observations seem to suggest?
He wasn't with them in between.
That the narrator was personally present, he stayed in Philippi and rejoined Paul later when he returned. This is a comment by Craig Keener. I really like his commentary. It's a 4-volume commentary on Acts, probably the most exhaustive that you'll find out there. But this is what he writes. He said, it is no coincidence that the we narratives provide the most detailed accounts in Acts. The missionaries' brief time in Philippi receives more detailed attention than 18 months in Corinth and as much as 2 years in Asia. That scholars often attribute the many accurate details of travel in 21:1 through 3, 7 through 8 to a diary, and that Paul's 2 years in Judea are the most detailed portion of the book. Most critical scholars, however, argue that the we passages are not direct evidence of Luke's authorship or presence. Why might they make this claim? Any thoughts? Crickets. So they, among other things, I'll mention this one, they argue that when we compare what Acts says about Paul with what Paul says about Paul in his own letters, that there are significant differences. There's discrepancies of detail, that where Paul was at certain times and with whom. So like, for example, in Galatians, right, I'll just throw this one out there. We'll come to it when we get there. In Galatians, Paul says, like after he received the vision on Damascus, he didn't consult with anybody. He didn't consult with anybody at all, went 3 years in Arabia, right? Then after that, 14 years later, then went up to Jerusalem, met with, Peter and James and so forth. Whereas in Acts, it looks like right after Damascus, boom, he beelines it toward Jerusalem and meets up with the Jerusalem apostles. And the argument is, okay, clearly the companion, whoever the author is of Acts, doesn't know what he's talking about, right? He hasn't read Paul's letters because that's not Paul's own testimony about what he did, right? Yeah.
I know about you to get there. That's not necessarily about a we passage.
Go ahead.
That's not necessarily about a we passage.
No, that's not about a we passage. I'm not talking about that being about a we passage right now. I was talking about what drives kind of like we got to look at these we passages in a different way, right? Also broader discrepancies. So, for example, in the actual teachings of Paul. So one example would be this. They would say in Paul's writings, the law is not binding for Gentiles. It's actually even dangerous as a means of justification. Paul talks a great deal about that. But in Acts, Paul is portrayed as law observant and respectful of Jewish customs to present harmony between Paul, Jerusalem, and Jewish Christianity. For instance, circumcises Timothy, right? Does like the ritual purity stuff in the temple, stuff like that, right? And they'll say that doesn't jibe. Again, we'll discuss these as we come to them in our study, because I would never get through this lesson if I talked about every single one of the things that came up. And probably still won't, but I'm going to try. All right. So this is a paradigm case example of the comments you'll hear from critical scholars. This is Bart Ehrman. I'll probably be picking on Bart a lot just because I think he's probably the most well-known out there in today's generation. Past generations, I might pull up someone like a John Dominic Crossan or Marcus Borg or a John Shelby Spong. For right now, I think it's probably Ehrman is the one that kind of gets the most airtime. But here's what he says. He says, what can we say about the so-called we passages of Acts? One curious feature of these accounts is how abruptly they begin and end. The author never says, then I joined up with Paul in Philippi, and from there we set out for Thessalonica or anything like it. Instead, he begins using the first-person pronoun without advance warning, in mid-stride as it were, and ends using it similarly. Look for yourself at the first occurrence of its use by reading 16:10 through 17 carefully. Now, someone might make sense of the abrupt way the author begins to speak of what we did by assuming that he joined Paul immediately before his journey over to Philippi. But how could one explain that the author left Paul's company between the time the possessed slave girl began following them around in verse 17 and the time Paul cast out the evil spirit in verse 18 or perhaps verse 19, right? So that's the kind of objections that you're going to hear. So that said, what are some of the alternatives they give for explaining the use of this we language in these sections? Well, one proposal is that it's a fictitious literary device, right? And there's some subsets of this, right? The idea is that the we is a stylistic flourish to draw the reader into action, not a historical marker of the author's presence. Has anybody ever heard this one before? No. A couple things to say by way of response. And again, this is not an exhaustive response by any means. We find the fictitious I and we claims in pseudonymous works and in fictitious documents like novels, but not usually in historical works. Now, typically there's a lot of debate on this. People will say, well, yeah, we do. We find it in Polybius, we find it in Josephus, we find it in Thucydides, stuff like that. But when you look at it, it's not quite so clear. When you look at like the use of we and stuff there, the argument can be made, okay, they're talking in terms of solidarity, like we the Greeks, or we the Jews, or stuff like that, right? Not necessarily a good, parallel to what we find here. But you do find it in pseudonymous works, and since Acts does not name its author or the narrator of the we narratives, the ancient convention of pseudonymity is not really relevant. What do I mean by a pseudonymous work, by the way? Yeah, like think if someone writes under a pseudonym, what does that mean? A different name, right? It's not really the real person that's portrayed to be writing, right?
Are they also talking about it being like the narrative from separate authors?
That would be more of a composite, right? But like say like First Enoch, for example, would be an example of pseudepigraphica, right? This is Sir Darby Knock, Arthur Darby Knock. He was a very well-known 20th century classicist from Harvard. This is what he has to say about it. He says, now nos, which is the Latin for we, right, as it occurs twice in the narrative of Bellum Alexandrinum, which was possibly not written by an eyewitness, may well mean, quote unquote, the Romans. And occasionally in Polybius, there is a we, which might represent an oversight in using a source. Nevertheless, I know only one possible parallel for the emphatic use of a questionable we in consecutive narrative outside literature, which is palpably fictional. Since on stylistic grounds the hypothesis of a redactor is excluded, I think we must take these statements at their face value. So, a couple questions that you can ask. If Luke were simply inventing the narrative's presence, we would expect it throughout the book on more consequential matters, it seems. Can you think of any other pivotal events where inserting a fictitious we would have made more sense? Think in the Gospel of Luke or the Gospel of Acts. What are some pretty important events that, wow, if you're going to put a fictitious we in there, that would have been a good place to put it. Pentecost would have been one, right? The Ascension, that's another good one. Empty tomb, yeah. But it appears in an obscure way, right? Seems to make more sense that the author is just including himself when he was present. Now, another one, this is kind of a subset. It could be a sea voyage category. So the argument's made that in Greco-Roman historiography, authors sometimes shifted it into we narrative, especially in shipwreck or travel accounts, to lend vividness or verisimilitude. And that seems to fit a little bit, doesn't it? Being accurate, being truth-telling, truth-tracking, that kind of thing. Because all four of the we passages seem to include sailing, don't they? Acts 16:11, so setting sail from Troas, we made a direct voyage to Samothrace. Acts 26, we sailed away from Philippi. Acts 21:1, and when we had parted from them and set sail. Acts 27:1, and when it was decided that we should sail for Italy. So there you have it, kind of coincidental. They all have to be about sailing. That seems to be a convention. Maybe that's how we explain them, right? What do you think?
Is that in general when someone's sailing that they use a we narrative? It doesn't make sense.
Okay, say it doesn't make sense? No. All right. So they would say that was a convention at the time. Wasn't always used, but often was. That's what they would say.
They say that other people use we when they were talking about other people sailing.
That's the claim.
They use we with John.
I don't think so.
That's not good.
Yeah. Go ahead.
This might be helpful to think of this as almost a subcategory of the first one.
It is. Like I said, it's a subset.
So that's kind of where we're at.
Yep. Yeah.
So what about they? Let's look at the other side of it. If we're arguing about we and sail, they also use the word they in sailing. What's the our
Yeah.
words here?
Yeah, they would also use they. So here's the thing. This one actually not a lot of people hold today. Because first-person narration, like third-person narration, seems to appear in all sorts of narratives, whether we're talking about history, whether we're talking about fiction, whether we're talking about by land, by sea. Even among the purported details in sea voyages in antiquity, the first-person occurrences are normally singular than plural, right? I. Also, if this explanation were true, it's curious that the we is missing a considerable number of Acts sea voyages in these other passages. Right? Why only from the leaving and going from Philippi? So even if there were a sea voyage convention, it would not explain these narratives' anonymity, right? Because it's not like he's saying who I am and trying, still an anonymous author, strictly speaking, or the narrative's limitation to just those sections for those geographical locations. So most scholars have not found this approach to be very persuasive. Well, that comes to this one. I think this one, if you're not going to go with it being who we would say was Luke, this will probably be the most plausible. The idea that one of the author's sources was a fragmentary travel journal that one of Paul's companions had kept. Maybe the author wasn't his companion, but maybe he was using a source, right, from a travelogue from that companion who was constantly writing we and just kind of left it in there like that, right? Does that make sense? Pretty much, yes. That's the idea. So in other words, the author was not the source of the we material, but he drew on authentic material from a companion of Paul. And it is true. I mean, we do know that the gospel writers drew upon sources, right? Because, for example, like if you look at the four gospels, let's say you look at the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Why are they called synoptic?
Because they
They're
cover
all
the same
legend.
general occurrences.
Yeah. See them all together. Which one do most scholars believe was written first? Mark, right? And then they believe that Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source, right? Because you find it just verbatim in sections of their Gospels. And also used another source, which is more of a hypothetical source. This is kind of debated. That's called Q, which means what? Doesn't mean question. Q is the Greek word quella, which means source. I believe this was a sayings gospel. I can't help but wonder, you know, we have church fathers that say Matthew first wrote his gospel in the Hebrew dialect. We know the book of Matthew cannot be translated from Hebrew, but it very well could be that Matthew was behind what we commonly refer to as Q. Again, it's hypothetical, who knows, right? So you have Matthew and Luke drawing from Mark, drawing from Q, and also their own respective sources, which the scholars call M and L respectively, right? So, but they work them, and the Q source are the ones that Matthew and Luke share in common, but Mark does not, and they're like verbatim. So they know they're sharing from some source, right? And there's different ways to work that out, right? So this could just be another such source, is the idea, right? What can we say with response to this one? Well, one is that the style and vocabulary of these sections still seem to be Lucan. In other words, the itinerary is comparable to other itinerary material in Acts, which suggests that if a diary was used, it seems more plausible to believe that it was the author's own. Now, having said that, someone could say, yeah, but maybe he reworked it in his own style, right? Now, in Luke 1:2, the author mentions getting material that goes back to eyewitnesses. But presumably, a lot of that material could have been in first-person form as well. Yet nowhere else does he preserve a first-person form. Why would he become an inept editor of this material at this point and this point only? Doesn't it seem more likely that if a travel journal was in use, it was the author's own?
I have, something to say, but, Tim's gonna have to. The literary, the literary critique in Luke,
Yes.
he does let things slip through sometimes. So that would be a counter argument, I think, to the inept editor part. Because sometimes he does do that when we see how he's copying from Mark.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's important that it is the pronoun specific. Right? Maybe it's more important that he does it general. But I don't know if that's true or not.
Say that again.
So it might be important that he does it at all with any word,
Okay.
any story, rather than it being most important that it's pronoun specifically.
So, I mean, maybe. But I still come back to the point, it seems awfully odd that it's just within the Philippi, this geographical location. And it's not just one slip up here, it's 4 different occasions. So that seems to kind of, I don't find that as plausible that this is just an inept slip when it's 4 different occasions. But I mean, I'm not married to the idea. I'm okay with it being a travel source. I'm not convinced. Yeah.
It's almost like it's a little very grasping at straws.
I'm sympathetic to that. Yeah, I'm sympathetic to that assessment.
It's got to be wrong, and we cannot prove it here.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that is a tough drive.
Otherwise,
Yeah, I mean, we're trying to Monday morning quarterback as best we can, right? This is a really good book, by the way. It's by Colin Hemmer, The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History. It's what he writes. He goes, why should the writer have preserved mechanically the inappropriate pronouns from a narrative by a different unidentified person? It is a phenomenon oddly out of step with the smooth Lucan unity we have observed, and is hard to square with arguments for redaction. And how could the reader understand it if not as a claim, true or false, to authorial participation? What do we mean by redaction? Like to edit something, right? Editing, redacting, that kind of thing. Okay, well, what about Ehrman's point about the abrupt way the use of we ends? Remember, he says someone might make sense of the abrupt way the author begins to speak of what we did by assuming that he joined Paul immediately before his journey over to Philippi. But how could one explain that the author left Paul's company between the time the possessed slave girl began following them around in verse 17 and the time Paul cast out the evil spirit in verse 18 or 19? What are your thoughts about that?
Greater passage of time than one verse.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, could be.
Can you read those passages so we understand what he's talking about?
You'll have to look them up for me.
But they're
Yeah.
just not relative to the narrative.
Here's some thoughts, right? Acts 16 through 18 focuses on the conflict between Paul and the slave girl with the spirit. That's the focus. Luke's literary concern is Paul's authority and the power of Christ, not narrating where we were standing at each and every moment with slavish obedience, right? The omission of we here is natural because the narrator does not want to insert himself into a dramatic exorcism scene. And it's kind of like I said, like when you're looking at ancient historiography, ancient biographies, the authors tend to be pretty selective in terms of, what they're going to do, what they're not going to do, stuff like that. I don't really find that as a knockdown, you got me type of thing. So why attribute Luke Acts to Luke the physician? Well, the internal evidence suggests that the author of Luke's Acts was Greek. All right, at least this is the argument. There are several things that has going for it. Luke Acts is written in very polished Greek, said that, not only with the Septuagint, but also with classical and Hellenistic Greek idioms. Suggests that someone thoroughly immersed in Greco-Roman culture. He also has Gentile sensitivity in the narratives. The way Gentiles are portrayed is usually positive as opposed to what you find in other early and Jewish Christian writings. And sometimes he explains Jewish practices as if he were writing for people unfamiliar with them. So can you think of any examples, whether from Luke or Acts? Any come to mind? I'd be impressed if it did. I mean, that's kind of an obscure point.
It's right when he's getting arrested.
Right when he's getting arrested?
Yeah,
I don't think I remember that part. I'm not saying you're wrong.
I don't remember.
Um,
We're trying to get.
I mean, it's kind of hard to recall. It's like most obscure things. I mean, I get it. Here's a couple examples. Luke 22:1. He explains that the Feast of Unleavened Bread is called the Passover. Probably not something you're going to have to say if you're talking to a Jewish audience, right? Maybe a Jew yourself. Acts 12:3 clarifies the timing of the during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So like little tidbits like that, right? And he shows detailed knowledge of Greco-Roman politics, geography, and social customs. And the preface to both his Gospel and Acts resemble Greco-Roman historiographical conventions, not Jewish literary forms. Right? So these things kind of give us a hint. It looks like we're talking about a Gentile, a Greek here, right? So again, but why? Why Luke? Well, if the author did accompany Paul to Rome, which the we passages, if you take them at face value, seem to suggest, he was probably with him during Paul's 2-year house arrest. The question is, might we expect Paul to mention him in letters he wrote during that period of time? Can you think of any of the letters that would have been written during that period of time of Paul's epistles? Do I? Okay, go ahead, say it loud and proud. Okay, maybe Timothy, right? Someone else? Philippians is a possibility, yeah. It's a possibility, some debate on that one. But Colossians, Philemon, Ephesians, and Philippians. Now, a critical scholar out of all these is only going to say, the only one we can go by is Philippians. They'll say that's one of the undisputed Pauline letters. They'll think the other ones are pseudonymous, right? That's a different conversation. But what we find in Colossians is this. Will someone read this for me?
Fellow prisoner Arviticus sends you his greetings, and as does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. You have received instructions God him, he comes to you welcome. Jesus, who is called Justice, also sends greetings. These are only Jews among my cohort.
Let me stop there. So what does that tell you about the names that have just been listed?
They're Jewish.
They're Jewish. So the author is likely, given what we just talked about, not going to be one of them, right? Go ahead, JP.
These are the only Jews among my cohorts. So the king, they have proved to take comfort. Epaphras, who is one of you and a servant of Christ Jesus, send greetings. Always wrestling in prayer that you may stand firm in all in the will of God. Pure and fully sure. I vouch for him that he is working hard for you, for those at Laodicea and Hierapolis. Our dear friend Luke, the doctor, and Demas.
All right, thank you.
Sorry.
No, you're good. All right, so we come down to Epaphras, Luke the doctor, and Demas. And we find these names mentioned again. Did anybody know what church Epaphras founded? Colossae, right? Thing is, it's probably not Epaphras because we don't have it. It'd be really weird if he founded the church of Colossae and Colossae is never mentioned in Acts, which it's not. So we think probably not Epaphras, right? Well, what about Demas? What's the problem with it being Demas?
I believe.
Yeah, what's this tell you about Demas?
He's deserted.
Yeah, he's deserted me. Paul's kind of ticked off about that one. Probably not Demas. That leaves by process of elimination who? Luke, right? The beloved physician. Now again, critical scholar will say, well, the only one that says he's a physician is Colossians. We can't really go by that, blah, 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 you know. So at this point, we can look at the external evidence, right? Do we have any sources in antiquity that attribute this gospel to Luke? Do we?
What's the question again?
Does anybody claim this is written by?
Does anybody claim this? Okay, Josephus? No?
It's the only one I think.
So here's some. We have Irenaeus, 180 AD. Now what you'll find critical scholars will say, yeah, but that's like over 100 years, that's roughly 100 years after the fact. That would be like today, the first time I'm talking about Hitler writing Mein Kampf is now, because that was in 1925, and the first time we hear mention of it is 2025, right? So they would say this is unimpressive, right? I'll get to that. So Irenaeus, he explicitly names Luke as the author, calling him the father of Paul. That's around 180 AD. The Muratorian canon, anybody know what this is? It's the earliest list we have of many of the books in the New Testament. So it identifies Luke as the author of the third gospel, notes he was not an eyewitness but a companion, and also attributes Acts to Luke. We also find in the anti-Marcionite prologue, which is in the late 2nd century. Anybody know what this is? Yeah, many people think it was a response to Marcion. It was kind of like in the prologue, like of the gospel. States that Luke is a physician of Antioch, wrote both of them. Also said he wasn't an eyewitness but a companion of Paul. You have Clement of Alexandria, quotes Luke's gospel by name, attributes it to Luke. Tertullian of Carthage, now you're getting to 200, 210, you're getting to the 3rd century. Explicitly identifies Luke as the author of the third gospel, refers to the Acts as the memorandum of Luke. And you have Eusebius, who incorporates some of these sources in his work, right, who also says the same. So you have the external evidence. Now again, critical scholars are going to say this. They're like, that's 100 years later, the first time we have Luke mentioned. Now Luke was recited earlier than that by people like Justin Martyr, 115, calls it the Memoir of the Apostles. You have 1 Clement around 95 AD, who quotes from Luke, right, stuff like that. But they'll say that this was a later Christian author who probably was not an eyewitness or a companion of Paul. And these are quotes taken from Ehrman. He goes, we don't have any record of anyone attributing Luke Acts to Luke until 100 years after its composition. Sure, the manuscripts now have titles like the Gospel according to Matthew or Luke, but those are titles no author would have given them. Nobody writes a book and titles it according to me, right? That's not a title, but somebody later telling you who in their judgment wrote the book. What do you think of that? You're like, so? And? So let's think this through. According to this theory, all 4 Gospels were originally published without any title or heading identifying its authors. So in contrast to many other ancient biographies published under the name of an actual author, the original authors of the Gospels deliberately chose to keep their identities hidden.
Hasn't John on?
Well, you still have that, you have the superscript on John that says the Gospel according to John, you know, that kata.
He doesn't say like, I'm John.
No. There's talk about the beloved disciple, and the end of John, John 21, it says, something to the effect that we know this person, we know their testimony is true, where the person's kind of adding to it.
I think you're thinking the Revelation.
Uh,
I'm thinking of that.
oh, is that what you're thinking? Yes, you're thinking of Revelation. Yeah, that's what you're thinking of. So recall in the ancient world, all books were handmade copies, right? They circulated with any titles for a century, and they're all handmade copies. It was only much later, sometime after the disciples of Jesus were dead and buried, that the titles were finally added to the manuscripts on this view to give them much needed authority. And because all Gospels were originally anonymous, it's reasonable to conclude that none of them was actually written by an eyewitness. I am sorry. Put me in the minority, I guess I am. I don't care about citing an authority, I care about the reasons. I'm not really tracking with you.
It's not titled to establish authority, it's titled to represent.
Here's the other thing. There is absolute uniformity in the authors to whom each book is attributed. Now, Bart will disagree. At least on the first surface of it seems like he does. He says, because our surviving Greek manuscripts provide such a wide variety of different titles for the Gospels, textual scholars have long realized that their familiar names, like the Gospel according to Matthew and etc., do not go back to a single original title, but were added later by scribes. Where is this wide variety he speaks of? This is going back from earliest to latest that we have. Everyone that's according to Matthew says according to Matthew. Same with Mark. Same with Luke. Same with John. If the anonymous theory is true, then why aren't some copies attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, but other copies attributed to someone else? If they really got their titles from scribes falsely adding them to manuscripts up to a century later, we would expect to find some contradictory titles. And as an example, the book of Hebrews was written anonymously. We do find that. In Hebrews, in some of the strands you find written from Italy by Timothy, from Rome by Paul, from Italy anonymously by Timothy. That's the kind of stuff you'd expect to see if there's some evolution on that, right? This is what Martin Hengel says. He says, if the Gospels had first circulated anonymously and had been given their titles only at a secondary stage and independently of one another in the different communities, because a title was needed for announcing reading and worship, this must necessarily have resulted in a diversity of titles, as can be illustrated by many examples from antiquity. There's no trace of such anonymity. Moreover, the case for Luke's attribution is particularly strong when you think about his prologue. Unlike the other Gospels, he explicitly names the individual for whom his Gospel is written, which is again who? Theophilus. This is what Richard Bauckham says. He has a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses that I really like. And he says the clearest case for an original title is Luke because of the dedication of the work to Theophilus, probably a patron. It is inconceivable that a work with a name dedicatee should have been anonymous. In other words, if the Gospel of Luke was dedicated to a known individual, it was probably written by a known individual.
Before you go on, I have a question, and it's probably like way off topic, and I totally understand.
It probably is. I'm going to say, why are you bringing that up?
No, I know. I know. So you were talking about how some of these things were brought up, like 100 years later. So I guess it's not really a question. It's more of a, I don't know, like, why would you? Why would they discount that when, there are people who are still making copies of those same, does that make sense? Original copies, I guess, like they're still making, you were saying to make a copy of it, it would take a lot of money to actually go and make it the whole thing, the whole book, chapter, whatever it is. Why would they keep doing that if it wasn't true?
Oh, well, someone could still believe something's true, but not know who the author was, right? I mean, many people argue that about Hebrews. Was it written by Apollos? Was it written by Priscilla? Was it written by Paul, right? But they still maintain it's true. We have other books in the Bible, we don't know who the author was. 1st and 2nd Samuel, right? Job, we don't know. So that would mean that it was inspired, it was revered, but not necessarily that you would know who the author was.
My point was, kind of inconsequential to question it, I guess.
Okay. Right, inconsequential to question it. I think that I do think it's consequential, because you want to. I can understand. I mean, when the church is collecting all the documents that would eventually go into the New Testament canon, they're choosing those that are earliest and closest to Jesus and the original disciples, and discarding those that were much later and derivative and forgeries, like the apocryphal Gospels, meaning which didn't show up until the second half of the 2nd century, claiming to be written by Peter or Mary Magdalene or what have you. You'll hear people say there are all these options and the church just chose theirs. Yeah, no. We know that if it's over 100 years from then, that it can't be the person. They're not alive anymore, right? So it does matter. It is of consequence. The genre of Acts, and I'll stop here. The New Testament books in Greek show diverse writing styles, like I said. Back then, a lot of people would mock the scriptures, saying that this is low-grade Greek. This is like bumpkin type language. I'm kind of putting my own type of stuff in there. This isn't the elite Greek, right? These styles reflect the author's different educational backgrounds. Luke Acts uses a Greek style influenced by historians, so you know that this is going to be a historical monograph. Pretty much everyone agrees with that. There are some notable exceptions, right? I don't think their arguments work. There's Richard Purvo that thinks it's a novel. I don't think that works. Now, they might disagree on how accurate that genre is, but typically they'll think it is ancient historiography. But in Hellenistic writing, the word acts denotes a recognized genre or subgenre in the ancient world, characterizing books describing the great deeds of individuals, whether it be Alexander the Great, Augustus, or even groups or cities, like the Acts of the early kings, right? And next time, I was hoping to get through this one last part and be done, but we're over time. So I tried, because I kind of want to get into the text itself, and this is just kind of laying the land, all right? So any questions about anything we covered? No. Stressing me out trying to get through it. All right.